Jonathan Choe, he covers a lot of issues pertaining to homelessness, obviously, and now he's finding this intersection between the homeless crisis and the immigration crisis, the migrant crisis. We have individuals, it hasn't been as high profile as, say, what's happening in New York City with the busing of migrants, but we have migrants that are ending up here. Jonathan Choe, and he filed this report, he's an independent journalist who works with Discovery Institute, but he actually filed this report for Turning Point USA as part of their coverage, and it's absolutely fascinating. So there's a church in Tukwila where migrants are coming up from the southern border, winding up there, and they're putting a strain not only on the church that's housing them, but on local resources like police, schools, and resources that are supposed to be going and have been going to Washington's homeless. Here's a part of one of the reports he's filed on this issue.
Riverton Park United Methodist Church is more than just a Sunday ministry.
I love you.
It's a 24/7 sanctuary and campground for the homeless in Tukwila, just a few miles outside of Seattle.
We need housing for these folks. We need them to not be in tents.
And now Pastor Jan Bolerjack is being challenged to show even more grace and generosity to those in need.
They somehow get this phone number, this address, and they show up here.
Along with the homeless already here, nearly 400 migrants
I've gotten calls from the southern border.
are now staying in tents and makeshift shelters.
Are the homeless and the migrants getting along?
Takes effort, but yes.
Almost all the men, women, and children are from Venezuela or Angola, and they barely speak English.
Parlez-vous français? Oui, français. Only français, okay.
And they've been here for almost a year.
They're kids, they're sweeping, there's so much going on.
There is. Aren't they beautiful?
When the pastor recently gave me a tour, it felt like controlled chaos. Most of the kids have cell phones and pass the time playing video games. The church kitchen is constantly being used.
Fufu. No fufu, this bread, okay.
Bolerjack says they have official papers to temporarily stay in the U.S. while seeking asylum.
There are men and women who are jumping over with kids who don't have paperwork either.
I don't know about them. I don't have them here.
Complicating matters, in some cases, there's a 2-year backlog to get cases heard in immigration court.
We can't take any more.
But she's refusing to turn people away.
If a family shows up, standing at my door, we take them.
But even with all the goodwill, the emerging problems are hard to ignore. I've obtained police records showing more than 100 dispatch calls to the church in the past year.
I do have a problem with that.
Incidents include responses for rape, 3 suicides, burglaries, auto theft, unwanted subjects on the property, harassment, lewd conduct, and vandalism. This is exclusive video showing a series of fights and arguments happening inside the church, and clashes over cultural differences between the Angolans and Venezuelans are now a regular occurrence. This woman, who goes by Maria, stays in a tent and wanted me to hide her identity.
No nos sentimos a salvo.
When we try to report or something, any problem, they don't take our case.
She says there are even more problematic incidents, but church staff members are pressuring them not to speak up.
So do you feel like the pastor's trying to cover up the problems or downplay the problems?
Ella todos los días miércoles nos reúnen.
She is very clear and consistent, asking us to keep the problems low, deal with her only, don't call the police.
Pastor Bolerjack did not respond to these allegations after I left the church, so I asked Tukwila PD for a breakdown on exactly who's responsible for what, but that data was unavailable. I also reached out to UMC leaders at the regional level to get some answers, but no response there either.
No respect for personal property.
For neighbors who live near the church, they're losing patience with the lack of transparency.
Pastor Jan just keeps trying to smooth things over.
And say the situation is spiraling out of control.
Yeah. And Jonathan has talked to, the mayor of Tukwila. He's been able to, really try to get a grasp on the extent to which their presence is further aggravating what is already a crisis with homelessness from people who were here. So we asked Jonathan Choe to come in because this is, we've had him on the show before to talk about homelessness, but this is such a complex wrinkle to that crisis. We asked him to come in, talk about his reporting and some of the things that he's found. Jonathan Choe, welcome back to Undivided.
Thanks for having me.
Who would have thought you'd be covering the migrant crisis in Washington State?
Yeah, there's a lot of crossover into the homeless crisis as well, because one of the big issue being brought up right now by homeless advocates is that the resources now being poured into this migrant crisis is taking away from the homeless response here in America.
Yeah. Well, we see, I think New York gets a lot of attention lately for how they've been overrun by people who are coming up from the southern border. So as we talk about this story, are these individuals who are being, brought here from the southern border or no?
It all depends. It's a wide spectrum. Last count, there were nearly 400 people at Riverton Park United Methodist Church in Tukwila. They've been there now for almost a year. And even the pastor, Pastor Jan Bolerjack, when I asked her point blank, where are all these people coming from? She told me she didn't know. They were coming in from all over the place. Look, bottom line, these migrants crossed illegally into America at some point. They ended up in Seattle. One anecdote, though, I heard, and I'm saving this story for, coming up in the next few weeks, is a young woman and her child initially were in Denver. But they were dealing with some scary, criminal situation. So then a nonprofit essentially paid for their ticket and flew them to Seattle and said it's safer in Seattle. There are more resources in Seattle. So more to come on that story.
Wow. So how did you start to look into this? Why did you start to look into this?
Well, my DMs, as usual, started, stacking up. I got messages from people on the ground, advocates, neighbors saying, hey, look, local Seattle media, once again, not covering this properly. It's not just about this church being generous, and they are, no doubt, being generous, this church community, to allow the migrants to stay here. But what they talked to me about and reached out to me about was the spike in 911 calls, the crimes, the trash, the litter. And one thing led to another, and I started to realize once I showed up that this situation was spiraling out of control.
And when you say, the trash, 911 calls, litter, is that just anecdotal based on what you've been told, or do the numbers bear that out with crime, et cetera?
Not only did I make a public disclosure request to get all the 911 calls from the past year, I'm seeing the trash with my own eyes, the buildup. It's just flowing into the neighborhood, the trash from the camp flowing into the streets. Now, no doubt the church and Pastor Bolerjack, they're trying to keep the facilities clean, but there's a sanitation issue now going on. But getting back to the 911 calls, I mean, you have calls for, attempted rape. You have calls for suicides. You have calls for theft, burglary, fights, harassment, vandalism. This stuff isn't getting out there right now.
Now, when you say 911 calls, just so I know that there's a tie here, is it to that address?
To that address,
Gotcha.
to that church.
Wow.
And I asked the city point blank, and they acknowledge it. And here's the challenging part of this story. Most of these migrants who are from Angola or Venezuela, they don't speak English. Okay. It's either Spanish or French, right? So things are getting lost in translation. But collectively, what everyone is saying, the people I've talked to, and I've talked to now dozens of migrants with translators on the ground, they're telling me right now that church leadership is telling them to not talk or complain about these issues.
Well, and that's what I want to start with before we get in, because you've had to rely on kind of whistleblowers. So although you're acknowledging the church is being very generous, the church and the church's church, they don't want you there. They don't want you to be reporting on it.
Yeah, this church is part of the United Methodist Church denomination. And of course, my process, as you know, is to reach out to all sides. I've not only reached out to the pastor who initially spoke to me, I reached out to the UMC regional offices and even national. And what's crazy is that they didn't respond to me at all. So I thought, okay, typical, hey, no comment on the story. But I later found out through sources who leaked an email to me, an internal email, showing that there is a systematic plan to ice me out now. There's an email that I've obtained from UMC saying, don't talk to Jonathan Choe.
Specifically. And it was translated into multiple languages.
Yep.
How does it make you feel?
I don't know. I think as a journalist, the first question is, why send out an email like this?
Right.
I just want to get your side of the story. So then the next question is, are you trying to hide something?
Yeah.
What are you sending an email like this out for?
So you have released and obtained some videos from inside that church.
Yeah.
To you, what does it depict?
What it really shows is that there is clearly a cultural divide here. You have migrants literally from different countries all trying to figure it out. And I get it, they're trying to survive. But with any culture, even American culture, you're going to have fights, disagreements. And, you know, these migrants, interestingly enough, almost all of them have cell phones. So they've been recording each other. And we're talking about fights, arguments, people saying that the Angolans have too much time in the kitchen. You have, you know, some of the advocates for the Venezuelans saying that the Venezuelans aren't getting enough time, you know, inside and indoors. So it's just this hot mess, and they're recording it, and they leak some of those videos to me.
What's another layer on this? The church tried to stop those leaks, you believe, by getting rid of internet access.
Yeah, that was another piece of this story initially. After you know, we started looking into the story, our sources on the ground, again, who were helping the migrants, came to me and said, Jonathan, there's a blackout now because they think you're snooping around and they don't want more of these videos to go out. Again, that's what these sources were telling me. And in fact, I asked the pastor point blank, did you cut the internet? She admitted to cutting it, but she denied that was the reason. She just said, hey, we cut the internet, and oh, by the way, it's now back.
So they cut off these people's, I mean, to the outside world, because presumably, I think common sense dictates why would they do that, other than to stop the leaks that are happening.
Yeah, and these migrants, at the end of the day, they're survivors. They figure, you know, how to, you know, get information out. Some of them would leave the premises and find a Wi-Fi connection and start talking to me or texting me. But again, there's now this overall kind of sense now, top down, that if you talk about the bad things, even bad things happening to you, you know, you will face retaliation, or you will not get the benefits that other migrants are getting.
So you had mentioned that there's not really a plan for them, but you also talked about how helping them is cutting into helping people who are homeless on the streets here. So can you talk about the intersection of that? I mean, there's empty hotels that, can't they go to those, or, you know, that were bought for homeless individuals that are empty anyway?
So here's, once again, something that I saw over the weekend that's been so frustrating for homeless advocates. Right now, it's getting cold, and no one should be living outside, especially migrants. But there are also homeless Americans outside on the streets of Seattle, and they're being told that there's no housing. They're being told there's no room in the hotel rooms.
How can there be no room? How can there be no house?
And yet, nearly 100 migrants on Sunday, and I recorded this, and I followed them, were bused to the DoubleTree Hotel in SeaTac, and now have rooms. So think about it. If you're homeless, or you're a homeless advocate desperately trying to get men and women off the streets of Seattle, Americans, you're thinking, why are the migrants getting preferential treatment? And where is this money suddenly coming from that didn't exist before?
Where is it coming from?
Well, good question. Initially, the pastor said that, you know, it was private donations and the church was helping. Also, you know, former Seattle, well, I guess she still is a Seattle City Council member, Teresa Mosqueda, who's now the new King County Council member, incoming. She was able to secure some funding. King County Council member Dave Updegrove also secured $50,000. And
taxpayer funds.
Taxpayer funds. So that's at least what I've been able to find right now. I've done a lot of public disclosures. I'm still looking into this. But the play now is to get federal funding. That's what everybody is waiting for right now. And again, another story that I'm looking into, and I'll talk about here, is that I have sources on the ground who are connected to a board. There is a board right now that is sort of overseeing the decision-making of where to put the migrants. And you have a contingent on this board that wants to put migrants into tiny houses. But then you have another saying, we have hotels open. Why don't we put them in there? So there's now a clash about housing as well.
Is the board private nonprofit? Is it a government board?
Well, what I'm being told is that it is a sort of makeshift board. It is nonprofit. It has one housing advocate on it, and the rest are sort of immigrant advocates as well. Look, they're there to help, you know, direct traffic, you know, and you know, how to get people into housing as quick as possible. So that's why it was created.
And of course, in the background of all of this is these are people who came to the country illegally, your understanding is. So do they have cases pending for review? Are they here as asylum seekers?
Yes, so so the pastor says that all the people that she's housing have the actual paperwork. These are the so-called migrants. They are here seeking asylum. Okay. I've even seen some of their paperwork.
So if that's the case, they didn't come in illegally. They came in through an asylum process that is, albeit flawed.
Well, They will admit, many of them will admit they came in illegally, then secured the paperwork to get in line for asylum.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So at this point, yes, technically they are now migrants seeking asylum, but they did come in illegally into America at some point, at least most of them.
I mean, do you think that they have legitimate asylum claims, or is this just abuse of the system?
We'll have to wait and see, because the other problem here is now immigration court is backed up for up to 2 years, 3 years in some cases.
Yeah.
So they're going to be here. So I think that's the bottom line, and that's the dilemma, right? Look, you have one camp where they're saying these people came in illegally. Why should we be, rolling out the red carpet for them? You have another camp saying, well, yeah, they're here now. They're human beings. We got to help them. So that's the dilemma.
Yeah, that's tough. I think you can be a little bit of two sides. I think you can have, as your coverage does, you can have empathy for them, right? And also not have empathy for the real disastrous state of our immigration system. And this is going to touch every community in the country.
Yeah, and thanks for bringing that up. My coverage, I try to objectively take on a story fairly and accurately. And there are migrants here who are being preyed upon. They're victims. They need help. Okay, there's sexual abuse happening. There's domestic violence happening in this camp. At the same time, there are situations where you have migrants gaming the system. So I'm trying to show all the angles here.
Yeah. Jonathan Choe, great work. Thank you for being here, and we're going to follow the story on the immigrants because you're the only one reporting on it.
Yeah, thank you. We really do need the rest of Seattle media to get on this because we've just scratched the surface.
Yeah, I wouldn't hold your breath for the rest of Seattle media to get on this. But a couple other interesting wrinkles to his reporting. He found out through some emails that Governor Janzi was actually supposed to go to I don't know if you call it an encampment at this church, but he was supposed to go visit the church last week, and then he didn't. His staff said there was a scheduling issue. So I don't know if that's true or if there was another reason he didn't want to go. And then Jonathan also had an update, which Nicole got an email about, a sort of tip, and it just happened to be that we were talking about this story today. There, last night or the night before, a baby girl was born to a Venezuelan migrant inside a tent on the grounds of Riverton Church. So, that's devastating, obviously. You don't want to see any mother give birth in a tent. Certainly it happens in homeless camps in Seattle, not infrequently. So there's just a lot of kind of wrinkles to this story. And Jonathan, if you follow him on Twitter, @ChoeShow, he continues to post videos and follow this crisis, which I think has been woefully underreported by Seattle media. So I'm really glad that he's on top of it.